In the wide gray area between war and peace, there is peacekeeping, and that peacekeeping is a way to help countries that have been torn by conflict and are in search of a sustainable peace.
Conflict resolution is critical because it will allow people who are affected by violence, affected by conflict, to find ways to resolve their conflicts, to solve problems, but to do so in ways that can lead to long-term sustainable peace.
How do we explain conflict?
Most conflicts have at their heart a particular grievance or something in which there's a fundamental disagreement. So the destabilizing forces such as economic inequality, such as resource depletion, such as the proliferation of weapons.
What about access to health care? What about access to one's livelihood, jobs? If you don't have a system that's equitable, minorities will feel that, in fact, they can't provide for basic needs. And one has to look at these structural causes of conflict that then can be exploited by conflict entrepreneurs.
I think it's misunderstanding. I think what happens is we just become very entrenched in our beliefs and we're not ready or willing to listen and learn the other side and what their experience is. And I think, again, when we break down to the very basic level what people need and want, it's not that complicated.
Hobbes had it right. There is a thin line between civilization and barbarism. And what keeps us on the right side of the line is government and free press.
Environmental stress is a huge source, and I think it's only going to get bigger. There are studies that talk about how conflicts over water and arable land, were at the base of the Rwanda genocide, of what's going on in Sudan with the Darfur conflict. So I think that's a huge one that's often overlooked. And that's just going to get worse with climate change.
Psychological failings of both individuals and groups. We're not very good as human beings at making rational judgments. We tend to, for instance, analyze risk extremely badly. We become extremely terrified by an act of terrorism, for instance, whereas in fact we're a million times more likely to be killed in a car crash. Because car crashes happen every day and you adjust to them and you think you can control them. Terrorism, you can't. And therefore you overreact to dangers which aren't really very dangerous.
The need for water in this world is huge. And who controls that water is the source of conflict, or the desire to have the water if they don't already have it. On a very basic level, it is the fact that we are fearful of the unknown. And the unknown is the other at the end of the day. And so whether it is individual to individual or whether it is nation to nation, it is that same idea. When we aren't able to humanize people, when we aren't able to see each of ourselves in the other, we then too easily find ways to divide.
The clash of cultures theory, Samuel Huntington, is the idea that we're all kind of we grow up in our own culture. You guys are here in Ohio and you like the Browns and you don't like war, but your culture is threatened by somebody else, somewhere else, who grows up doing something different, with a different religion or with a different thought process, and they are scared of us invading them with eBay and Coca-Cola and McDonald's, and so we develop fears and we fight each other.
A maldistribution of resources. We've got plenty of resources, I think. There's plenty of food, plenty of money. We're also plagued at the same time right now by a global inequality of wealth. We read about all the time the inequality in America, but this is a global phenomenon. Billionaires, multi-billionaires, all around the world.
The key is that conflict is inherent in the human condition, so how can we find nonviolent ways of addressing conflict?
BDS, or boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And that's a way to peacefully put pressure on Israel to change its policies. It's not a new strategy, although it has a new name, BDS, but it's a strategy that's has a long history. It was used in South Africa. It was been used in the United States civil rights movement. It's just a matter of applying economic pressure to try to move those in power so that they change their position.
The tools that we really need is our cultural awareness, language awareness. We're really bad at those tough foreign languages that very few Americans speak. When you get to know someone, it's very hard to hate someone and kill someone. But so often we don't know the people we're dealing with. Our soldiers don't know the people they're dealing with. The languages, the culture.
I don't think you can get involved in peacemaking if you don't try and take off your lens and look at things through other people's perspective, because we're different. We inherently have different values, and in order to really come to some consensus and to try and meet halfway, we've got to be willing to stop and listen and authentically try and put yourself in someone else's position.
I think the inclusion of human rights in education curriculum around the world is truly one of the most critical pieces to having sustained and prolonged peace.
When I worked in human rights, the main number one method was what's called naming and shaming, which is where you very carefully document the human rights violations that are taking place, and then you publicize them as widely as you possibly can to try and create shame in the government that's doing them. Or if that government receives aid, say from the United States, then you try to get the US government to put pressure on them to clean up their act.
As human beings, we can find ways of preventing, managing, and reducing the negative consequences of conflict.
It's really just stopping and trying to understand with a real humanitarian lens what's happening on the other side. And I think we could make a lot of progress if we looked at people like Gandhi and nonviolence and Martin Luther King and others to really help lead us. It's such a divisive time in the United States and in the world. And I think it starts with a person and at a community level with Peace Corps. A volunteer and their impact on those around them was profound.
I think the important thing is to have policies that promote social justice and fairness. And then, if you're on the right side of the issues, I think you're in a much better position to promote peaceful solutions. And you're going to get a lot of support from, other nations and other peoples throughout the world if you're on the right side of the issue. So that's what I think is the most important thing.
Instead of sending soldiers and bombing and killing, people in far-off lands, we do a lot better off by providing schools and healthcare and highways and hydroelectric plants, things like that. If we're true to our values of Americans, help spread those things, not necessarily to think and act exactly as we do, but I just see those types of the soft power, the language, the culture, the infrastructure skills is much more important and much more beneficial in the long run than the pure and sole exercise of military force.
It's critical to make sure that people have a sense of security, that there's strong, good, legitimate government, there's a rule of law, there's economic development, people have to feel that they're prospering from peace, and people have to feel that their sort of well-being, that their needs are being met economically, but also in terms of things like healthcare, education, and how people are benefiting economically is also critical. Is it equitable? Do people feel a sense of justice?
I think sustainable peace building has to be built on something called transitional justice, which is a way of providing truth-telling, documenting what were the violations that happened, so that and restoring dignity to the victims. It has to include some kind of accountability for those human rights violations. It should include prosecutions of those. You don't have to prosecute everyone who ever committed a human rights violation, but if you get the key leaders who were creating the massive violations, then that's going to take you a long way toward getting some kind of closure and making some kind of reconciliation possible. There's also a role for, say, memorials, for apologies, for all kinds of, it has to be a multifaceted approach to restoring the dignity of the victims, to establishing the historical truth of what happened, and to, sort of getting a whole society to confront that.
Conflicts, I think, today are over oil or over water between states within countries. They are over the suppression of people's human rights. It is the fact that people are being excluded and marginalized and told that they are less than others. And so I think it is actually a combination of all of that that brings us to where we are today.
So the most effective peace building actually is what we call inclusive peace building, which is not just agreements made between the elites or diplomats or leaders, but in fact peace that is agreed to and believed in by many different elements of society, what we call different stakeholders, those who are affected by whatever agreements are made. And when you have sort of a peace that's very inclusive, then people feel they have a stake in trying to live up to it and hold their leaders and hold their government accountable for what's been agreed to.
Well, it's definitely better from within, because then it's got the legitimacy, and it's also more likely to last. Peace building should be from within. But in some situations, it's just impossible, because the warring parties have all the power and are not going to stop, unless there's some pressure from the outside. So ideally, it should be from within, but sometimes that's not going to happen.
The only way to do work in country is through partner organizations. It has to be at the very grassroots level, as well as at the grass tops level in that country, but it has to be initiated by people from that country. And
in order to build peace, it has to come from within those societies or within a community, because they, first of all, understand the nature of the conflict or the nature or the root causes of why there is conflict. But even more importantly, they have to live with whatever emerges between the different parties that are in conflict. So for peace to be sustainable, it has to be something that the people affected by the conflict resolution or affected by the conflict, they have to believe in, they have to own it, and they're the ones who are going to be affected by it.
The future of Mali was in significant jeopardy, even though you had in the 1990s an end that is officially to conflict. You had a peace agreement, you had political arrangements, violence was still percolating, and through a series of conflict resolution and mediation efforts at the local level that actually percolated upwards, and that got embraced by the larger political process in Mali. Mali has actually had peaceful transitions of government, changes in power, and has developed conflict management techniques that have, in fact, are much more prevalent throughout much of the society.
You could look at Germany after World War II. There were the Nuremberg trials, which I think it was 12 of the Nazi leadership were sentenced to death and executed for their crimes. Germany has turned many of its concentration camps into museums. They've got lots of memorials all over the country to the victims. They have really tried very hard to atone, in a sense, for what they did. You could look at a country like South Africa, where there's been a what they called a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which invited both victims and perpetrators to come before them and tell the truth of what happened. That one had sort of mixed success. You could even look at a U.S. example, which is after World War II, the United States took 40 years, but apologized for the internment of Japanese Americans, paid reparations to the survivors, and created a memorial to the victims in Washington, D.C. So that's a really nice example. It took a long time to come about, but it's a nice example of owning up to the things that a government has done that violated human rights.
If there's a recognition down the line that there should be equal rights, I actually think that Israelis and Palestinians can live together and govern together and live in peace. And I think, South Africa is a reasonable model. I mean, South Africa was controlled by a white minority, and there was a peaceful transition that has led to a government that's controlled by the majority. But in that happening, certainly whites have been treated fairly. They've maintained their rights, and there's a great, it's a peaceful society. So I think if it can happen in South Africa, it can certainly happen in the Middle East.
Security is critical to being able to have peace. Security is critical for people to be able to develop, to have economic prosperity, to have social well-being, to have good governance. So it's not that you don't need tools of security. You need defense forces, you need police, in order for people to feel safe, that their families are safe, that their societies are safe.
I think that sometimes military involvement may be necessary, but particularly with regard to the United States, it's often the first as opposed to the last action that's taken. And sometimes it's used also for to impose particular interests, and so a military intervention can be tied to economic interests, like controlling oil in the Middle East, and that's certainly not the kind of military intervention that I support.
Yeah, in some cases it's absolutely necessary, and hopefully it's done by a group that doesn't have another agenda, in the sense that it might be United Nations peacekeepers. Although they don't have a great record, they're better than all the alternatives. So it's much better to have a peace that is monitored by UN forces than a peace that is, say, monitored by a rival government's forces that will not have the same legitimacy, either at home or in international community.
I'm not sure that military presence is the right way to go for sustainable peace building. Look at what the wars we're fighting now, Iraq and Afghanistan. We've been there for 17 and 15 years respectively. I think without a lot of other stuff behind it, intelligence and understanding, oftentimes the military weapons, the military resources are a temporary stopgap measure at best, and doesn't result in any kind of long-term sustainable peace strategy, besides being horribly expensive into the billions and trillions of dollars. Again, I think the military is required sometimes, but it must be used very sparingly, very quickly. There need to be clear goals, and we've seen our own country struggle with our goals, whether it's Vietnam or Iraq and Afghanistan right now. What are we there for? Who has to go over there? When do we come home? When do we call a victory a victory? So I don't have a very positive view on using military force by itself as the vehicle for sustainable peace building.
Well, I think that, you know, you can't take on the entire world at once. So I think you need to pick issues that really interest you for one reason or another. For me, I got interested in Israel and Palestine in 2014 when Israel carpet bombed the Gaza Strip, and thousands of innocent people and children and women and innocent men were just slaughtered. But you know, there's so many hot spots around the world and important issues around the world to get involved in, and people, you know, I think find their way to work on different issues based on their own experiences and what they're interested in.
I try to teach students that they can be activists. You know, that they have all the kind of privilege that we have here living close to Washington, D.C., everything that we have, that gives us both an ability and a duty to take some responsibility for what's going on in the world. And that, you know, kids can make a difference. Their voices can make a difference.
Well, the first thing you do is actually start in your own backyard. Every society has their own set of problems, whether it relates to human rights, whether it relates to the role of the police, whether it relates to justice, economic development. I mean, you know, all you have to do is pick up the paper in the United States and know that we're facing many issues ourselves. I think what we've developed, whether it's in the United States or in Europe or a number of what I would say are stable countries around the world, is we've developed means to address problems nonviolently in most cases.
Work to inspire peace in our country every day. But by that same token, what we advocate for and what we're able to advocate for here in the US in terms of foreign assistance for other countries has an impact on peace on the world, because what we can ask our government to prioritize with our tax dollars is a way to influence peace.
I ask kids, you know, what can we do? You know, none of us can change the world, but if each of us, you know, did a little bit, and then we did that around the globe, we could make giant changes in the planet.
I would just say, if you're considering work after college and you're really not sure about what you want to do, Peace Corps is a phenomenal opportunity for young people. You have freedoms in ways that you've never imagined, and you have the ability to impact people and communities in ways that you'll never regret. You know, you meet a Peace Corps volunteer, and they've seen the world in different ways, and they will forever be changed by it. And when one volunteer meets another, you share this sisterhood or this brotherhood that helps you know the greater world. I think in order to understand America, sometimes it's important to pull ourselves out of our society. Just by virtue of our birthright, we are privileged, and most of the world is not. I think it's a very humbling experience, and a very good opportunity to figure out who you are and to push yourself a little bit and to push yourself out of your comfort zone. But the rewards are exponential, and you rarely meet a Peace Corps volunteers who regret serving. So if you're in doubt, consider Peace Corps.
Peace is not the absence of war, but peace is actually where human rights are fully realized. What that means is that the idea of peace building for us in the US does not need to be a concept that we think of that needs to happen elsewhere. It's a concept that is actually something that we need to be working on day in and day out in our own lives, in our own communities, in our own states, and in our own country.